Coal and lumber are two of Appalachia's greatest exports. The mountains of the region are rich in trees like chestnut, hickory, oak, locust, pine, walnut, maple, cherry, ash, birch, and the great yellow poplars. In earlier times, settlers viewed the wealth and variety of mountain timber as one of the most important elements in their self-sufficient lifestyle. They fashioned their log houses from the trees of their homesteads and used the wood for fuel, tools, furniture, and a variety of household goods. Even today, the forests of Appalachia supply farmers and craftsmen with the essential materials for their labors and livelihood. The coming of the railroads changed this local pattern of consumption. Railroads opened up vast tracts of Appalachian timber to the industrial northeastern and midwestern portions of the United States. Large logging and lumber companies moved into West Virginia, Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina to exploit these rich resources. American hardwoods, in particular, were much prized both in our own country and in Europe. Commercial interest in Appalachian timber in turn encouraged railroads and logging firms alike to secure control over this bountiful regional resource as they moved through the area. Thus, by the turn of the century, the lumber industry emerged as one of Appalachia's most important economic enterprises. The phenomenal growth of the industry was a direct result of the railroad boom between 1880 and 1920 and the growing demand for Appalachian hardwoods at home and abroad. In Dickinson County, located in southwestern Virginia, for example, no fewer than 18 lumber companies opened and expanded their operations prior to the First World War. Yellow Poplar, Courier, McCorkle, and N.B. Dodson were just a few of the firms that purchased timber rights in the county and began harvesting hardwoods during that period. One of the biggest logging operations in Dickinson County, Virginia, was the W.M. Ritter Lumber Company. In many respects, it was also typical of the logging operations of its day. W.M. Ritter began building his lumber empire in 1890. Ritter's early operations included logging sites in Mercer, McDowell, and Mingo counties, West Virginia, Buchanan and Dickinson counties, Virginia, and Pike County, Kentucky. He later moved into Tennessee and North Carolina as well. His first band mill was constructed at Avondale in McDowell County, West Virginia in 1899. Ritter's success and rapid expansion as a lumber magnate stemmed from his ability to work closely with railroads, such as the Norfolk and Western, and the Big Sandy and Cumberland. His agents would purchase the lumber rights held by the railroads, or they would buy the rights directly from the mountain people who owned them. It was not unusual for Ritter agents to pay as little as 25 cents apiece for the great trees of the region. Once the rights were purchased, the land was promptly stripped of its trees. The timber was then either shipped to mills by train or drifted downriver to log ponds and millworks. The lumber companies provided the railroads with regular and profitable business. Ritter and his fellow lumbermen also benefited from this arrangement. Only the farmers and communities of the Appalachians suffered, their lands denuded of trees, their soil depleted, and their ecology so disrupted that flooding became a major regional problem. The W.M. Ritter Company was organized in 1901. By 1913, the company owned over 2 billion feet of hardwoods located in West Virginia, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina. By 1940, the company had harvested more than 3 billion feet and had 70 to 100 million feet of lumber in storage, including white and red oak, ash, basswood, poplar, walnut, cherry, and birch. Much of this wood went to make fine furniture and flooring. In fact, all of the flooring of the old Conrad Hilton Hotel in Chicago, as well as many of the floors in the great houses and palaces of Europe, were made of Ritter Company products. Even car and truck bodies were at times made from Ritter hardwoods. Ritter was a successful entrepreneur and a king among lumbermen. In many respects, however, he is typical of the employers of his generation. Towards his workers, he was both paternalistic and authoritarian. In a letter to his executive staff, Ritter emphasized the need to protect and lead the workers as an essential element of company policy.
The success of this company depends, to a large extent, upon the enthusiastic and loyal support of its employees. This can be secured if those in authority will always be fair, just, and human in their attitudes towards those under them. The discipline in our organization must always be maintained, but this can be done and still maintain the goodwill and the loyalty of our employees. You know full well we have spent a vast amount of time, thought, energy, and money in devising proper methods to minister to the comfort, welfare, and happiness of our employees, and this must be continued. In addition to the human side of such treatment to your employees, it pays, for men will work better and accomplish more if they are comfortable, happy, and well-fed. And the nearer you can come to securing the goodwill of your men and their loyal support, the better results you will secure from their work.
While all of this sounds very well, the reality of logging camp life was not as pleasant or humane as Ritter's letter may suggest. The people who labored in the logging camps of Appalachia led a life of toil, struggle, and deprivation. And it is to these people that the Appalachian hardwood industry owes its prosperity and success. Logging camp life is not well documented. The Ritter Company was an exception in that it published its own magazine, The Hardwood Bark. Such sources do tell us something about camp life, but they tell the story, for the most part, from the company's point of view. Even the photographs are posed and do not capture how people lived and worked. But we can piece together a fairly accurate picture of camp life from the personal histories of the workers themselves. George Bailey Fletcher and his wife Velvy May McLaughlin Fletcher both worked for the W.M. Ritter Lumber Company. The Fletchers are local people, born and bred in southwest Virginia. Their experiences in the logging camps of the 1920s and 30s are typical of the period.
Well, I went to school in Buchanan County, Council, Virginia. And then after that, I got to working for this logging company. And my brothers, older brothers, and my daddy worked for the W.M. Ritter Lumber Company. And my daddy also worked for Yellow Poplar Lumber Company that was in that county before W.M. Ritter was. And I got started in the logging that way.
And my parents, they worked for W.M. Ritter Lumber Company even before they were married. And part of the time they would work steady for W.M. Ritter Company, and then they would leave maybe and go work at something else for a while. But then they'd end up going back to Ritter's. And we always just called it Ritter's and to make it short. And was when we moved to a farm on Fletcher Ridge. That's where I met Bailey. Well, he went away to work for Ritter's after he quit school and went off to work for Ritter's. And when he come back then, one summer, he came home to help the family make a crop. And that's when we really started dating. And then we were married about 3 years later, and we moved then to Ritter's camp. And in the course of time, then we started raising our family, and we done like my parents had done. We'd live in the camp a while and then go back to the farm for a while.
Thus, very much like families in the coal mining regions of the Appalachians, mountain families tended to stay with logging from one generation to the next. For the men, work was demanding, dangerous, and exhausting. It paid well compared to other jobs available in the region. Room and board were provided for those who lived in camp. Families received little shanty houses to live in. The camp also had a company store where workers could purchase goods with scrip issued by the company. These purchases were then deducted from worker paychecks at the end of the month. Since most camps were isolated and at times inaccessible except by train, the company store was the only link between the camp and the outside world.
They worked every day but Sunday. But then in later years, they would work 5 days a week. They done that just with what they called a cross-cut saw and a man on each end of it that done the sawing. There was no chainsaws or anything like that. When I first went to work for them, it was all horses. They done all the pulling the logs and moving them to where they could load them out on the log train. They done all of it with horses. But then years later, they did go to using a Caterpillar tractor on long hauls, you know, where they'd have to haul them a long way. The train, it brought in the log cars from the mill where they sawed the logs. It brought the empty cars in and spotted them at the loader. And they'd load a car and then he'd pull down a little ways with it for the next car till they would get a train load. A train load was figured about from 18 to 20 or 25 cars, just according, you know, to where it was. Hauled them with the horses to the landing where they could load them on the log cars. And they used two different kinds of loaders. They used a stiff neck loader that wouldn't turn around, and then they used an American loader that would swing them all around. They rode the train from the camp where they were staying out into the woods. Sometimes it'd be several miles out. That's the only way there was going. There wasn't any county roads or anything like that you could get to the right place. That was the only way of getting there, was walking or riding that log train.
By the 1930s, there were more roads into the mountains, especially along the railroad lines. This provided better communication between the camps and the outside. It also led to greater mechanization in the tree harvesting process. However, the 1930s also witnessed the effects of the Depression and hard times in the logging camps.
Well, I was attending to the lobby during that time, and it was pretty bad. It got down to, well, at one time we was working for 10 cents an hour. And, of course, everything you went to buy was cheap. You could live cheap, but you worked cheap. 10 cents an hour is, I seen it at one time. I worked for it myself. It was pretty hard time.
Nor were there any unions to protect worker interests.
At the time I worked there was no union at all. More than once in a while, maybe a bunch of men would get together and decide they wouldn't go out that day, you know. They didn't have any union or anything. Mm-hmm. They just, maybe all the Teamsters or something like that would decide they wouldn't go out. They'd get something done, you know, about more pay. And they wouldn't go to making preparations to go out on that morning. Then by the time the superintendent got there, they'd call him. By the time he got there, and maybe the division superintendent come in. By the time they got there, they went to harnessing their horses and getting out. And that was all the trouble it was, too.
The camp itself was mobile. In fact, many of the buildings were actually railroad cars serving as offices, dining halls, and dormitories.
Now, the kitchen and dining cars, they were on wheels, just like box cars, and they left them that way. They would put they called it a side track. They'd run this track off and put the cars on it. They'd be maybe like on one end there'd be a car that the cook's family stayed in. And then next to that there would be a dining room, one car that would, and they could feed 30 men at one of those tables. It was a long table, and nothing else maybe in that dining car except maybe for what they called a potbelly stove. It would heat the dining car in the wintertime. And then next to that would come the kitchen, and then on the other side would be another dining car. And then from that, maybe it would be a car where some of the officials would stay in, some of the boss that stayed there all the time. And then from that, it would be bed cars and the lobby where Bailey spoke of, where they would sit around of a night and talk, and just kind of, well, just a lobby that described it. And then maybe more sleep cars than below that. They would disconnect, take it, and just leave it sitting there on those tracks. But the tracks didn't connect until they'd get ready to move, and then they'd connect it back up to move them on the wheels. And then the houses that the families lived in was portable. They were just one room, say like 12 by 14, something like that. And they were built real sturdy, so they could, they'd put this cable around them, and the loader that loaded the logs, it would lift these rooms up and set them on the cars where they haul the logs out on. And then when they get ready to, when they move them, get to where they was going to, they would unload them. And they would set 2 or 3 and set them in a way that they could build a room then in between them. And some would have 3, and some would have 4, and some would just have 2. Sometimes they would just set 2 of those together. And a small family, that would be all they'd have.
Some camp workers were local people, and some of these may even have sold their own timber to the Ritter Company and later hired on to cut it down. These men commuted into the camp and spent their weekends on the farm. However, most of the men, some with families, lived in the camp year-round. Bachelors lived in a series of dormitory or sleeping cars. Their social life revolved around the lobby car, where their activities were limited by company policies or the caprices of the camp superintendent.
Some camps and some superintendents that would let them have music, and some wouldn't. And the one that I worked for, the superintendent that I worked for, he didn't allow the music where all these men stayed. Now, in your home, if you lived there in one of their houses that had your family there, you could have any kind of music that you wanted if you wanted to have it. But in this lobby where all these men stayed, this particular superintendent wouldn't have it at all, because they get to drinking moonshine and get that music to going good, and they get to dancing and have all kind of fights and all that.
Even so, lobby life was not without its lighter moments.
They had a kangaroo court, and it wasn't, to really settle disputes or anything like that. It was all fun. You could just make up anything you wanted to on anybody. Tell your men trying for it. Not be a word of truth in it. But it was all for fun, to get some fella up and give him a hard time. And we'd have a judge and have the jury and witnesses. They were one man, he was real good, as a judge. We'd take them in there and try them and fine them. They'd have to go to the store and get candy or something like that, Treat the whole bunch. That's what it all ended up with.
Some workers brought their families with them to the camps. These people found camp life much more difficult than it would have been in a permanent mountain community. Schooling for the children, when it existed at all, was poor. There was no church in the camp, and the monotony of evening life was only occasionally broken by the visits of an itinerant preacher and a week of revival meetings. Loggers worked Monday through Saturday. Now and then, neighboring camps might hold baseball games on Sunday afternoons or celebrate special occasions together. The only regular social activities took place at the camp store, at the men's lobby, and at meals. Camp food stuck to your ribs, and most workers considered it pretty good.
And my parents, now they cooked. My daddy was cook, and my mother, they called her a helper. Now he'd always try to have 5 dishes. He would have maybe 2 or 3 2 vegetables and a fruit, and then dessert, and then to that he would add maybe rice or something else, like sometimes rice and sometimes macaroni and things that way. Well, the main course would be beans, and they had all kinds of names for those soup beans, and it was usually soup beans and pintos or something like that, and with a big piece of fat back, they called it, in with the beans.
Logging had its share of dangers, but only a few camps had their own doctor. For accidents, illness, and childbirth, the camp relied upon the services of the company's doctor, who usually lived down the line near the company's mill.
Yeah, it was dangerous work. There was quite a few accidents, and there was a few men got killed out. They had more men killed with the train crews that was hauling the logs and loading them, and the men that cutting the trees down. Had lots of accidents with just any kind of work, building a railroad or taking up a piece of railroad or driving a team of horses or anything like that. But you hardly ever heard tell of them getting killed only with the train or the cutting the trees down. Yeah, they had doctors. He didn't stay right in the camp. He stayed at the mill camp. But any time they had an accident or any needed a doctor, why, he was the company doctor. He was obligated to come. He generally would come on a motor car that run on the track. That'd travel a lot faster than the train would, maybe be 30 miles to come. But he would come on that, they called it a wheel or a motor car. And he would travel on that, unless they, at a certain camp place, there might be a road leading in there. Then he would come in an automobile.
When it come time for the children to be born, they'd have to send out and get the doctor. Now, usually they had a telephone from the camp in the woods, they called it, to the mill camp. But now, once in a while, these lines would get down, and it'd take maybe 2 or 3 days to get them back in working order. And in cases like that, well, somebody had to ride a horse or go on the motor car or something and go get the doctor. But the doctor would come, and the children be born at home. But then later, when they got to the camps out to where there'd be roads into the camps, then the doctors had cars and the families had cars, and they'd go get the doctor that way, or call, and the doctor would come. And but fortunate that people always seemed to get along all right. There was no complications. Seemed like then, like you hear of so many complications now in childbirth.
For women in particular, camp life was both trying and difficult, but they withstood these hardships as best they could.
Well, now, for the women living in the camp, most of the time they were satisfied because they knew nothing else. A lot of them, just like I was, had grown up in the camp and knew a lot about it even before they went to raising their own families. And in their homes, they had just the bare necessities, and most of them were satisfied with that because they went out to their neighbors. That's what their neighbor had too. And the only object was keeping their families clean and comfortable. They wanted their houses clean, and they wanted them as warm as they could have them in the wintertime. And as a usual thing, they were easy to have with the pot-belly stove. Everybody had them to heat their house with. And no running water at any time. As for their privacy, they didn't have much of that. They'd have maybe for their bathroom would be one end would serve one family and the other end would serve the other family with a partition between. And if you wanted much privacy, you had to take you some cardboard boxes and tack to the wall in between.
Writing in 1916, W.M. Ritter took a different view of these experiences and hardships.
I am very proud of the reputation that this company has with the citizens in the various communities in which our plants are located. And it is a great satisfaction, not only for the material benefit that have accrued to this company by such a policy, but because this policy has been of great material benefit to the communities in which we operate. We have at times gone into communities that have been remote, crude, and undeveloped. But through the influence exerted by our representatives, we have established law and order, raised the standards of living, ingratiated ourselves into the goodwill and confidence of the inhabitants of those communities, and have accomplished what I deem to be the highest kind of charitable work.
The good work of the Ritter Lumber Company and companies like it may have brought new industries and jobs to an economically depressed region of the United States. But their success has stemmed from the existence of a rich and largely unexploited natural resource. The companies also owe a debt to the hard-working and honest people of the Appalachians who harvested the great trees of the region and moved them downriver to the mills. Like their brothers and sisters in the coal mines, the logging camp families of Appalachia provided for the prosperity of their employers, the lumber and railroad companies that owned the rights to the timber of the mountains. Logging practices, especially clear-cutting, disrupted the ecology of Appalachian forests. This in turn led to soil depletion and weakened the natural barriers against flooding. Many view these problems as blatant examples of regional exploitation by outside corporate interests. During the 1920s and 30s, it was certainly true that the logging companies benefited from the resources of these mountains, but at a high human cost. The scarred hillsides and flood problems that these enterprises left in their wake are now part of Appalachia's legacy.